Well, good afternoon and welcome to today's CEDA conversation, COP26, an insider's view. My name is Melinda Cilento. I am the CEO of CEDA, the Committee for Economic Development of Australia, and I am today's facilitator for our conversation. I'm really excited to be joining you from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I do mean excited because obviously for anyone who's watched me in live streams, you know I'm normally coming to you from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. So I have actually finally left Victoria for the first time in a long time, and it's nice to be joining you from a different land. I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging in the spirit of reconciliation, and thank the traditional owners for being custodians not only of land, but of sharing their traditions, cultures and history with all of us. In terms of today's topic, COP26, an insider's view, many of you will know that CEDA's focus when it comes to climate change is really trying to understand how we can enable Australia to regain its energy future and maintain and build climate resilience. Against the backdrop of the important conversations in Glasgow, we've been running a series of events really to try to help inform and excite, if you like, interest around COP26 and how we can actually look to the opportunities that managing the transformation of climate change will bring for the Australian economy and communities broadly. I think there's a consensus that's emerged in the lead up to COP26 and really around the dialogue that we heard from those conversations that business in particular is really leading the charge with the support of subnational governments. So in Australia, of course, the state governments. And I'm really looking forward to hearing in our conversation today about what business is doing and what more they can do to continue to drive this important transformation of our economy and the opportunities that that brings. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that in the conversations at Glasgow, there was progress made in other areas that perhaps have had less attention and focus. And here I'm talking about issues like biodiversity, which when we think about climate change and the impacts and response is also, of course, really critical. And then there were conversations, and again, really important ones around how we support and enable transformation in countries that are still developing and in countries that are going to bear the impact of climate change, as well as communities within Australia that likewise are really in frame in terms of the transformation and the impacts of climate change. Big meaty issues that I know each of our speakers today are going to address, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have. So let's jump into it. A few sort of housekeeping pieces that if you've been on these live streams before, you'll be familiar with. Of course, we'd love you to be on social media, getting the attention of people who aren't watching this live stream. If you're on Twitter, please tag us at CEDA_news, and we're using the hashtag COP26 today. I think there's going to be a lot of questions, and so again, you should know the drill by now, but we use the Pigeonhole app. You'll see details on the screen now, but in your browser, ceda.pigeonhole.at and the passcode insiders. Jump on there, ask your questions. If you don't want to ask a question, you can actually make sure that a question that you're interested in moves up the list by voting for it if you're not going to ask it yourself. So get in, start asking questions, because I think 60 minutes is going to go super fast today. I would, of course, really like to thank our sponsors for today, Arup. They've been really strong and consistent supporters of work, the important work and important conversations around climate change. They've been strong supporters of CEDA, and we're great to have them supporting this event today and making sure that we can keep these conversations flowing. Now, a quick intro to our three speakers. We've got joining us today, David Thodey, AO, who many of you will know. He is wearing his hat today as co-chair of the Australian Climate Leaders Coalition, which was announced not long ago. John Lydon, who many of you will know, wearing many different hats. He too is wearing his Climate Leaders Coalition hat, but was on the ground in Glasgow, so is going to bring that really interesting perspective. And then we've got Joyanne Manning from Arup, who is the leader of their circular economy work. And so I think is really going to help take us through some of those broader issues that perhaps haven't had the same level of attention. In terms of proceedings today, each of our wonderful speakers is going to speak for about 5 minutes. And then we're going to jump into a panel conversation, and before you know it, 2:30 will be upon us. So with no further ado, I would really like to just welcome David Thodey to our virtual platform and get him to kick off our conversation today. Over to you, David.
Yeah, thanks, Melinda, and it's great to be here with John and Joyanne as well. It's really good. And look, I'm on the land of the Camaragal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd just like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Now, it became hard to keep me to 5 minutes, but I'll give it my best, Melinda. So what I thought I'd do is just talk a little bit of a couple of the reflections from COP26. I wasn't there, John was. And then talk a little bit about what the Climate Leaders Coalition is doing. So the first thing is that I mean, from afar, I was actually really impressed with the way business turned up in Glasgow. And I don't know if you saw it, but there were some really big commitments made by very large corporations, from BHP to Rio, investing in significant amounts of money in addressing decarbonisation. Now, it wasn't perfect, but it was, I think, some of the biggest moves we've seen, and also a lot of the investment community turning up and saying, hey, we're not going to invest in you unless you've got a clear, pathway to net zero. And don't underestimate how powerful that is. And even just yesterday, I attended a conference call with Fidelity, who laid out very clearly what their expectations of big corporations were. So always good to have a bit of incentive to do it, but they turned up on their own accord. Now, I think this is so important because I do think that sometimes we leave it to government to lead, and it's actually up to us to lead. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But look, I was really impressed. I mean, this might surprise you. I thought India stepping up to the plate. You can't underestimate the challenges of these big economies. And while it wasn't what we would all want, they really came a long way, and I was impressed with that. Look, from my work at CSRO, I've seen enormous work done on the impact of methane, and to see that coming through in the release was really powerful. I don't think a lot of us realize just how detrimental methane is, and we really do need to find a solution to it. And of course, it gets right into the core of an agricultural livestock, and that's where a lot of it comes from, as well as from manufacturing. And then look, the deforestation I think is so important as well. So I think all these things were really good. I mean, we all would love it to be, we're going for net zero by 2030, sign up. We won't talk about, our government's commitment to, what they put out, but, I thought it was okay. Not enough, but okay. So look, the Climate Leaders Coalition, let me just spend a few moments on it, because this was an initiative of the B team, and who's led by Lynette Main here in Australia. And it was over 18 months ago when Lynette said, look, we really want to pick up a project we can bring, corporate Australia together to address decarbonisation in a collaborative way. Now, look, in a way, it's a bit like the Champions of Change in terms of trying to address gender diversity within large corporations. But it is, it was a really good initiative, because what it was all about was actually getting corporates to the table in a non-confrontational way. It was more about getting the CEOs, there's only CEOs, and there's about, I think we're up to about 34, John, now, where they come together and they share their experience, good and bad. Now, so let me take an example. I'm on the Ramsay Healthcare Board, and, we run a lot of hospitals, and, some of the hospitals have, solar, some don't. We use a lot of plastic, we use a lot of other stuff that are necessary for keeping people alive. And it's not easy when you go across, we have, 450 hospitals, about, near 100 in Australia, another couple of hundred in Europe, and about another 100 in the UK. It's actually really complicated when you stare into it. And of course, you've got to allocate capital, And it's a really tough discussion to go through. So it was really being people to have an honest, frank discussion around how you address decarbonisation and what we can do. Interesting. We wanted the fossil fuel people and all the energy groups there. We wanted them to be part of the conversation so that we all stared at the same problem and shared, our learnings. So what we did was, after we've been going for about a year, we only meet once every quarter. We get a CEO to talk around their challenges and what they're doing. So we go from Santos to BHP, to Coles to, the banks, and they all sort of give their perspective. And I think it's a rich conversation. Then we thought, as we went through this, that we should try to at least share some of the learnings. So thanks to John O'Brien, and I should say John Lydon, who's really done a great job in this area, we put together a roadmap. Now, we would love everyone to commit to net zero by 2030, or in the case of Telstra, by 2025. However, that's not realistic for everybody, and that's the whole reason that we want to get different perspectives. And so we ask people to make a commitment, but we're not prescriptive about when they need to do it by. So it sort of takes this sort of pressure on, and there's sort of a peer group sort of pressure comes together. So when we're in Glasgow, John hosted a meeting in Glasgow where we launched what we call our roadmap to 2030, and in it, it's got a roadmap, the sort of things that CEOs and boards should be looking at. And by the way, you would have seen that report that came out from the investment community said that the Australian boards are probably, well, I won't say the worst prepared, but they're not as prepared as they need to be to really steer into this topic. We have, case studies, we have CEOs talking about what they're doing, an overall guide to decarbonisation, and also what are some of the the things that you can do in taking your business case through to the board. What are the impacts? I mean, let's take Rio, for example. I mean, they took a $7.5 billion investment to the board by 2030 to reduce their emissions by 50%. So these are big numbers and really hard, but business needs to lead. So the other thing, and I'll just finish on this, is that we've got three work streams we're working on because they break into groups. The first one is looking at a regional geographic transition plan. So you could take the Pilbara or Gladstone or some of these areas where if we could get shared infrastructure, we could really make a difference in terms of decarbonising the whole supply chain there. Now, it's early days, it's complicated, it's not easy, but you're getting people coming together to talk about it. The second area for anyone who's been around looking at Scope 3, Scope 3 is really hard, and it often represents something like 65 to 90% of a company's broader carbon impact. So it is significant. So you're looking at your value chain and how you impact others. And so people are really struggling with that. Scope 1 and 2 is a bit more, we've got to get people through Scope 1 and 2. It's a bit clearer, but Scope 3 is hard. And we're trying to build a practical guide for anybody really, but CLC members about how to approach that. And we're going across consumer goods, the whole building environment, energy, etc. And then the third stream is around, financial sector and just how we can start to get access to this $130 trillion that is sort of being pledged that's going to help people move through. So I'll finish there. I'm sorry, I've probably gone over, Melinda, I apologize, but, really agree with your introduction. We've got to lead. Business has got to be right at the front. Yes, we need society, but be conscious of the impact of bringing the whole of the community with us and working with government. So I'll stop there. Back to you.
Thanks, David. Really great sort of summary of the CLC and its ambitions. And I think just to pull out a couple of quick themes. I mean, the sort of competitive nature, if you like, and trying to get the ones that can lead, businesses that can lead and excel in certain areas. Actually, a theme that we heard from the state environment ministers in the last live stream that we did on this topic, where they were really challenging each other positively to to do more in the places that they can. So I think there are really strong parallels. I'm going to give you a question on notice, not for now, but question on notice, that one of the things that I'd really love to understand a little bit more about is it's great to see business working together, but how do we bring government into that? Not necessarily looking for them to lead, but to make sure that everyone's on the same page and that we haven't got any barriers that could, unnecessary barriers. But that's a question on notice. John, insider's view, Glasgow, I'm a bit of an international meetings nerd, so I'm really looking forward to hearing the good oil on, or bad pun there, on what went down in Glasgow.
And by the way, I wouldn't call myself an expert or an insider either. I just am innately curious. So I'm also, every day learning something new. I am privileged to be coming to you from the land of the Gadigal people today, and actually acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging. And also I feel especially privileged because 6 weeks ago when I headed to Europe, I was not expecting to be fully enjoying the land of the Gadigal people. I was expecting to be enjoying a small hotel room on that land. But the fact now that we have these new freedoms, I think, is also remarkable. So thank you to the state of New South Wales, at least, and I hope everybody else joins us in that safe freedom soon. So what would I say? And certainly one big perspective that you get from Glasgow is it's different. You see the world differently than if you hear about it from Australia and the Australian media. So I'll try to bring that to life a bit. It's not lost on you, the urgency at a gathering like this. And you'll always pick up some little facts, right? Every day that goes by, there's another 116 million tons of carbon discharged into the troposphere, which, by the way, if you got into your, Tesla and drove it directly upwards, it'd take about 5 minutes, the troposphere. So it's a very thin and fragile layer on this planet. And because of that, I think this is one thing I learned. We've got like the energy or heat energy of 600,000 Hiroshima scale bombs every day. That's the heating effect of those emissions. That happens every single day. By the way, 93% of it goes into the ocean. You all know the consequences of that. So the urgency is huge. I think as a result, there were very high expectations about this COP, this implementation COP, as it were, and almost set up to failure. People like Boris Johnson, the UK Prime Minister, had such high expectations, almost certainly not going to be met. You don't just get 197 countries to all agree in 2 weeks to something, given the range of starting points and ambition levels there. So I wanted to set the context of urgency and complexity. So with all that, I am optimistic. I'm optimistic about the progress. Now, certainly the progress in business. I'll come on to the real business of COP in a minute, but the business, which is really what I was there for in the circles I was in, as David, as others have said, is meeting the challenge. This is an area where, whether it's the First Movers Coalition, which was sort of formed around that, whether it's the amount of innovation and, including some terrific Australian companies. I think, what is it? It's the little minerals startup that won Best Energy Sector Startup, Minerals Carbonation International, I think it's called, and many other wonderful examples of that innovation in businesses large and small, and a real commitment that business has to play its part. And that's what the Climate Leaders Coalition in Australia is all about. It's not another lobby group or anything like that. There's plenty of those, they do good work, but this is about business reducing our own emissions in our backyard and helping each other, a safe space to help each other get there. So business certainly playing its role. The finance sector, absolutely playing its role. Actually, you know what? You couldn't tell between sometimes a big finance sector, bank or debt or a fund manager, and an activist, because they are increasingly speaking the same words, where climate activist and a big source of capital. So the Glasgow Financial Alliance, GFAN, that was formed there, I think it's $130 trillion of investable assets. And that's way more than half the investable assets in the world. That's all committed to Paris, 1.5 degrees net zero. So I think at the actual Paris Agreement, that was about 10 billion, and now it's 130. So you see the speed and scale. And if you're worried, about making investments, you've got to be worried about how you're going to finance those. And I'll tell you, that is a lot of the investable capital. In fact, Lord Stern estimated that there's already a carbon tax of $80 a ton on greenfield investment because of the higher cost of financing that investment if you're not net zero. So think about that, right? Let's not argue about technology taxes because there's already an effective tax on business when they have to finance their investments. So the finance sector coming along. And then the real business of COP, the conference of the parties, if you like, the political and the international working towards agreement, those 197 countries. Now, that wasn't why I was there, right? It was like you got to see the chamber on a big screen in the zone I was in. So it's like going to Federation Square to watch the Open final, right? You're sort of close to it, but you're not participating. And however, I'd say that made way more progress than people in Australia at least give it credit to. David mentioned about India. I think that's a game changer. There's 2070 for sure, but it's actually the 2030 commitment that they will reduce emissions per unit of GDP by 45% by 2030. And, if you think about it, then they'll probably grow GDP between now and 2030 by about 45%. So they're effectively saying emissions will be the same level then that they are now. And whatever the old HSC maths, Roach's theory or whatever it is, that means it's going to peak, right, this decade, mid-decade. And for a country that has not had the advantage of burning fossil fuels for 200 years like we have, to say their emissions are going to peak mid-decade, if they deliver on that commitment, that I think is a game changer and starts to show that this is a global opportunity. So I'm optimistic there too, plus all the plumbing, I think that you mentioned, the reporting being put in place, a lot of the implementation elements, the remaining ones from Paris are there, and the scene is set for more progress at the next COP. So I'm optimistic from the COP. And now Australia. So I was curious, what's the real view of Australia from COP? Because if you read the headlines here, it'd be all about Scott Morrison and 2030 and methane. Actually, it's something different. There's something a bit more subtle that the people in Glasgow were thinking about Australia. And you can take this as a challenge or an opportunity, depending on who you are, right? So it was this. It's that Australia is like the sleeping giant of this space. And why are they still sleeping? Because they have the best natural resources, renewable, low carbon, no carbon resources in the whole world. Why aren't they doing more with them? And of course, I'm talking about the solar, the wind, but also the access to the land and capital that can help harness those for the transition to sustainable future. So it's kind of like you're sort of Saudi Arabia 100 years ago, right? You just found all this oil under the desert at the same time people are starting to drive cars. And you say, oh, don't worry about it. We'll just leave the oil there because we don't see why that's important to us, right? So kind of like that. That's how the world sees Australia, which to me is an opportunity, but it's only an opportunity if we use it as one. And that is business working with the community. It's not good enough just to bring projects. We have to reconcile traditional ownership of that land. Perhaps there's a new form of partnership that goes beyond FPIC, right? Goes beyond your classic mining lease agreements and TO agreements, but actually creates a sustainable future for those communities as it does for the planet. Perhaps there's an opportunity to bring communities with us and create great jobs and skills in that future so they don't have to be reliant on some of the jobs and skills that honestly, even the people who work there probably know are not going to be around in a generation. So Australia, that's the view, right? Why is this a sleeping giant? When is Australia going to wake up to its potential? And that then shows the whole complexity. So the final takeaway I had is the complexity that this isn't just about carbon emissions, it's also about nature, as David said, right? If you're just getting on your finance, if you're a CFO just looking at your TCFD, you need to also now be thinking about TNFD, right? The natural capital financial disclosure. You have to be thinking about your biodiversity report, not just your emissions. So That's complexity. There's a social complexity that this doesn't happen without the people wanting it to happen and seeing their place in the future. So as I am ambitious for the Climate Leaders Coalition, I think leaning into some of those challenges, because business has a role as part of a system where the system has to work together. So we're going to get there. There'll be a transition. I'm convinced. It's just how orderly is that transition? And does everybody want to gain and does gain through that? They're the questions we want to help with.
Yeah, thanks, John. It's a really nice way to sort of round it out. And, I think, putting the ambition on the table and putting the sort of the reaction to Australia, but in a kind of positive, we're just waiting for you to do, kind of step into this is a really interesting one. Joyanne, over to you. I know some of the things that John touched on in terms of community impacts on some of the developing countries, but also the sort of natural capital piece and the biodiversity piece really plays into your area of work. So over to you.
Thank you, Melinda, and welcome everyone. I join you today on the lands of the Turrbal people, and I pay my respects to their leaders, past, present, and emerging. I think, unfortunately, I don't have more confidence that the planet's on track to retain a 1.5 degree after COP. And I know so, but there were significant pledges made, and I think David and John have referenced some of these. I think, and some of these are very much related to nature and to our material footprint. So one key one to me was actually the pledge to end deforestation by 2030, which was from a material footprint on our planet is very, very significant. We have the financial sector and major nations committing to stopping to fund fossil fuel projects by the end of 2022. I think what would have really made that extremely powerful if they had linked it to a commitment to replace those fossil fuel energy with renewables. So they fell short on that, but that would have really made that game changing. The commitment around methane from the 100 countries is actually really very, very significant. Methane is the second largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. It's actually primarily with regard to landfill, agriculture and energy. And for me, who work within the waste industry and the circular economy on a daily basis, and in a country which is still heavily reliant on landfill, this is a really positive step for Australia, and it will really actually specifically help drive the drive to get organic waste out of landfill, which is the key contributor to methane by 2030. So there's a federal commitment to halve it by 2030. In line with the SDGs, and nearly every state and territory has now committed to the same. So hopefully we will see real progress in that, and the associated investment in that infrastructure needed for that to happen. And then finally, the majority nations agreeing to phase down coal and retain their commitment to the Paris Agreement of less than 2 degrees, but hopefully as close to 1.5 as possible by 2050. So to me, I actually think Australia's performance, from here was as expected. Prior to COP, the government announced its net zero 2050 plan. However, we do know that the next 10 years are pretty critical for action, and we don't have that much sight on that. Two of the key actions of the plan rely on technology, which is not commercially proven at scale. However, it is the likes of Arup working in collaboration with government and industry that can help progress the viability of these technologies at scale. And I actually believe we absolutely can do that. We have the innovation and we have the smarts to really drive progress. And now we're seeing the business sector and the financial sector willing to, significantly invest as well. And also, as we just reiterating what both John and David said, absolutely what was clear from COP is that industry, cities, self-government levels of state government entities, and really civilians through NGOs have taken the lead. And the numbers of industries in Australia and across the world that have committed to accelerate their net zero targets by 2030 or before 2030 has rapidly increased in recent months. So I think John and David mentioned a large number already. And a really great example of this is actually Transport for New South Wales. And they have committed to the whole of the Sydney train fleet to use electricity that's going to be derived from renewable sources. Significant investment in electric buses to join their fleet, and stamp duty incentives for EVs as well. So for Arup, some of the key takeaways, I've kind of got 4 key takeaways that we've really focused on. And the first one is that the energy transition is more than just switching to renewables. And this is, so are we phasing out or phasing down coal? Well, actually, it doesn't really matter, because really what we have, it doesn't change the fundamentals of that text, is that the age of fossil fuels is really rapidly drawing to a close. And the language of phasing down really was a UN first. And for its investors, it's really, really clear. And I really like this idea that we already have a kind of an inherent carbon tax now, if you're not going to basically deliver on that, regardless of, sort of this nation's opinion on carbon tax. So as the global transition to net zero carbon energy accelerates, it will actually, though, be essential to identify and manage transition risks. And this will be how we can actually move faster towards a net zero future for our energy and power generation, supply and consumption. And we also need to use our technical expertise to really support the energy and waste sector reduce their methane emissions through asset management. The majority of actually methane emissions through energy come from leakage and from just sort of poor asset management and decommissioning of existing energy facilities. And as I've previously mentioned, for the waste sector, it's really heavy investment in resource recovery infrastructure that's going to be needed across Australia. Secondly, low carbon transport and so using transport to drive a net zero future forward. And what's interesting is that now the proportion of the global economy covered by the net zero deadline has actually really spiraled in the run up to COP, which was fantastic, and it's now 90%. So achieving these goals, they will require deep and rapid and comprehensive decarbonisation on a sector by sector basis. And for the transport sector, decarbonisation will be far more than just adoption of electric vehicles, although EVs are really a critical part of the solution. So effective transport decarbonisation strategies will actually require us to think about the system and transforming the whole of the transport system rather than relying on specific modes and vehicle types. And our global transport leader, Isabel Dedring, actually presented at Glasgow on the opportunity of using a circular economy systems approach to accelerate clean transport infrastructure, but also clean fuels. So that was fantastic to see. And we've mentioned nature, bringing nature in, and this is really important, and climate strategies must protect, restore and enhance nature. Because we know that the climate crisis is actually a nature crisis and they're completely interlinked. And the Glasgow Climate Pact emphasised the importance of protecting, conserving and restoring nature and our ecosystems. And all credible climate strategies now going forward need to work with nature and to use nature-based solutions to build resilience. And this is how we will protect, restore and over time enhance nature and get ourselves to a regenerative design rather than essentially green design where we currently are. So Arup is really leading in this space, and we can draw on our extensive research that we have undertaken, our thought leadership, and actually our global experience in nature-based solutions to accelerate opportunity and adoption locally here. So we have a real opportunity to help for second mover advantage on that. And finally, our collective response to climate change must include greater focus on building resilience to climate impacts we cannot prevent and achieving a just future for us all. And climate resilience and equity, I believe, will increasingly dominate future COPs and other international dialogues. But we as a nation have a role to play to ensuring that we provide a just future for both ourselves and our more vulnerable neighbours who are very close to us. So finally, Arup has placed sustainable development at the heart of everything we do. It's centred to our both global and regional strategies. And we've made this personal. I love Mary Robinson. Who's part of the BT. She calls on us all very much to make everything personal. And Arup as a firm made this personal. And we and our staff and everybody who works for Arup is driven and is brave to work with our clients and challenge our clients to achieve the outcome and the best outcome we can for people, place, planet, and importantly, prosperity. Thank you.
Thanks, Joyanne. That was a great way to round out the conversation and a really fantastic segue into the first question that I'm going to actually put to all of you. And I think it's really jumping on this bandwagon around business leading, but I think the question really is about, it's great, in a sense, yes, you've got businesses who are leading, but what do we do about the businesses who aren't? What do we do? And the question is pitched in the context of laggards. And, I've sort of referenced some of David's comments around this competition. What do you think about, yep, you've got the pack out the front, it's good. They pulled the rest of the peloton along, to use a bicycling analogy, but what more needs to happen there? And I might turn to you first, David, if I could, just sort of wearing your Climate Leaders Coalition hat and think about, are you looking to broaden the group? How does that group extend its own influence beyond those who are at the table?
Right. Well, look, I think it's a really good question. Look, our approach is that we will be expanding this group and trying to build different, coalitions by industry, interesting, Joanne. So, because we do think there are industry solutions. So, look, but this group is only one of many. We're only, we went to a influential group. For this group, 34, I think it constitutes a quarter of Australia's carbon emissions already. So it's that group, but we do want to extend it. Look, the bigger question is how do you get small and medium business, mid-sized business steering into this? And that's something we look at, through Zero. I think partly it's just leadership and putting it on the table and peer group pressure, because that does make a difference. I mean, look, if I'm a small business working down on the South Coast, I'm going to listen to the people around me. I'm not that interested in, David Thodey from, corporate Australia telling me what to do. I'm interested in what we're doing. So I think there's that peer group pressure. Look, I do think that there's already, you're seeing, like, we went to market recently to raise some debt and we got a better rate because of our carbon emission strategy, decarbonisation. So there was inherently an incentive to step up. And look, I do think that governments can play a critical role here. And I think they need to be at the table in setting policies and incentivising everybody to move. But it is, it's a wide church we're dealing with, and we're trying to keep the politics out of it and just get on and do what we can. So that'd be the three things I'd say. John might have a different view.
Well, John, I'll go to you next, and then Joyanne, I'll talk to you about just in terms of how you're working with business as well, and how you translate thought leadership beyond your own client base, but to the broader business community. But John, anything you want to add to David's observations?
I'd completely agree with David, first of all. And hey, in 18 months, we went this Climate Leaders Coalition from about 10 CEOs when it started to the 34 today, and at least a quarter of the emissions. So that's already some scale, right? Now, I do agree that if you don't want to go there yourself, if this is not your strategy, then it's going to be forced on you by whether it's your customers, your communities, your employees, your finances. And you've got a choice, really, if you're a business and you're saying, well, I know this is something I've got to do, and people are starting to ask me the question, but I'm not really sure how to respond. Do you want to get out ahead of it or not? Because there's still some businesses, I think everyone is having to comply, but is it a box ticking? Is it ESG as something else we have to do? Another separate report that can be a really good glossy report, but it's separate. Yeah. Or is this embedded into your business and the way you work, the way you engage, and the way you run your business? I'd really argue you'd consider the second one. So you've got small business customers, probably, if you're a big business. Right? How are you helping them? There's a business opportunity in that. Right? If you're a bank, you might help those customers to decarbonize before they have to. So get ahead of it. How are you helping the communities where you operate? How are you retraining and reskilling your employees? So consider those questions for what your impact can be. Please don't get this, I've got to be dragged there, and therefore I've got to do all this compliance and new reporting. Because if that's your attitude, I think it's only going to get harder and harder, and you'll miss an opportunity.
Thanks, John. And it's not a perfect sort of analogy, but there are examples, I think, of where we've seen this really play out. The one that I'm most familiar with is looking at big organisations who were tackling issues around Indigenous employment, and then actually worked really, really constructively but very proactively to drive that through supply chain as well, not just in terms of demanding employment targets amongst contractors who are working for them or whatever, but actually helping to develop the frameworks and the knowledge to be able to make it happen as well. So I do think there are examples that we can look to where, precisely to your point, business that's out front has taken what it's learned and rather than sort of doing it from a punitive or sort of penalising sort of way, actually tried to grow capability in all of the businesses that are supporting them and working with them. Joyanne, I'm sure that's something that you know a bit about, not so much Indigenous employment, but that sort of concept of working constructively. But how do you think about thought leadership in the sense of reaching out beyond, as I said, your client base, but also to SMEs?
Yeah, so I think for us, it's very much around trying to, as what John was saying, is trying to get people to really embed it as their business as usual rather than an add-on, nice to have. So how can they actually seek to sort of essentially transform their businesses to this is their new norm, this is their new baseline. And one of the things we do then is working with government in terms of trying to provide them with evidence and with an understanding of businesses' needs. So what we're finding ourselves doing much far more now when we're developing sort of, you know, papers for government or position papers or helping them derive new policy or strategy is that there's always a very clear market sounding or industry engagement to sort of have, you know, have that sort of feedback loop through. I think, though, it's one of the things that's vitally important is to increase literacy across, you know, all aspects of the value chain. And I think that's actually, you know, one of the things we're facing as a real barrier at the moment is that there's pockets of great literacy, but when you sort of fall down through, it's not flowing down. So we see it, and I talk about from a circularity point of view, I talk about the fact that, you know, we can have circular strategy, but if we don't have circular businesses and circular design and circular materials, it won't work. It's basically a systemic, you know, it's a systemic approach, and all parts of the system have to act in harmony and unison with each other. So equally, you know, it's the same with the, you know, decarbonisation. You're only as good as your weakest link along your chain, essentially. So we need to get all the bits of the chains really hardened up, and everyone sort of basically operating at the same level. So it's but story, you know, really demonstration. And proving and storytelling and as much, you know, evidence that we can share with each other is vitally important.
Yeah, Linda, can I just reinforce, you know, what Joyanne's saying? I mean, Xero at the moment, because we just deal with small business every day, we've been doing quite a bit of work because it's part of our scope 3 of how we deal with them. And actually, to your point, Joyanne, there's this personal awareness, but then when they come to their business, there's just this lack of awareness about, well, what do I do with this? And is it just going to cost me more, right? And so rather than seeing this as a way of attracting new people, getting access to finance so I can do the transition, and then working through with the community. So I think that, you know, companies like Xero, other big corporates can really play a critical role there, and in an authentic way, not just sort of, you know, a government message and we've got to comply, more about getting in and doing things. So I would encourage every corporation to be doing that. And we need to, because remember, you know, all 2.5 million small and medium businesses, that's the lifeblood of this economy, and does so much employment. We need to really, you know, steer into that. So I really agree.
Yeah, thanks. And I like the sort of circular economy analogy. It presents, I think it literally presents challenges though too. If I think about the way government works, and if I think about a lot of the criticisms, quite frankly, of government policy that isn't working, where that you hear the consistent message that everything's in silos and different levels aren't talking to each other, et cetera. And I'm just going to pick up a theme it's absolutely the number one question on everyone's minds, and it's picked up in a couple of different questions in different ways. But when we had the state environment ministers on our live stream, they all talked about what they were doing, and basically to a person, they were all looking for more from the federal government. It's been picked up in your comments. Each of you have reflected it in one way or another. I mean, how can business work more closely and collaboratively in a more circular way with governments of all levels, but particularly the federal government, to get more demonstrable progress? I'm going to quickly glance around and see who wants to lean into that question. David, you work with government all the time. They get you to write reports all the time.
Oh, they do. They don't necessarily do anything with them, Melinda, as you know. That's a different issue.
Have you got the silver bullet for me?
No, I don't. Look, I think that there's no question we need to keep the dialogue going, keep engaging, putting a positive story there. But I don't have a high expectation, because it's not rational. It's purely political, and that's the problem. And when I say political, it's self-interest, not looking at the greater good of Australia. So, but that isn't going to stop me trying, and we go down to Canberra and share, but I'm not going to buy into their petty party politics, because it's just not, there's nothing rational about it. Do I agree that we need to help local communities who've relied on fossil fuel to transition? Of course I do. It's critical for all of us to do that. And it isn't governments who solve that. It's companies who, create a new future. Maybe, yes, some funding would help, but I'm just sick of relying on them because they're not going to do it. And therefore, it becomes a negotiation between two parties about how you can extract more money on some other thing. So I think that we've got to step up and take leadership. That doesn't mean that I'm not open. I'll engage with the minister, I'll engage with with the department, but I'm just not relying on it because I just think it's the whole foundation of the discussion is immediately tilted. So we just get on and do it. And I'm afraid that's just the truth of where I'm at. Now, state government, I've got to say, there's some wonderful initiatives. Long may they continue to step up to net zero. If they can do it by 2030, give it a go. New South Wales, Victoria. Obviously WA's got other issues to consider, SA, but we will encourage and work with anybody who wants to make a difference. But I'm not going to have irrational arguments or discussions around technology roadmaps and things like this that, are only a part of the solution. So I'm sorry to be a little bit frank, but that's where I'm at,
David, I love it. John?
I love the pragmatism, right? And there's the voice of sort of experience. I think that, business has a role in creating a positive future because actually business can make the investment, has the products, has the employees. Clearly that can be helped by government, particularly in regions, in high emissions regions. What's interesting to me, and I'm just curious about it, I don't have any answers, is very quickly sustainable becomes the economically rational strategy for business. So what happens then, right? Because I think the community will realize that. They will see where the jobs are going to be. So you might start to see that political space move. Right, the Overton window, as it were, moves into a zone where actually government's going to be scrambling to get to where the future is, federal government, that is. And maybe we're starting to see the beginnings of that now. Meanwhile, there's loads business can do, and there's some really good collaboration with state governments. So
there is.
Joyanne, I'm going to flip a question to you. You can answer the government question if you want, and then I've got a circular economy question as well.
I know. Just very quickly, I just think, though, from an Australian point of view, I think what's going to happen is, particularly for businesses that are involved in the export of products and materials, they're going to find themselves being hindered, as a result of our federal fiscal system here. So therefore, I think you'll start seeing pressure come through that way. And I think, you were seeing the states, New South Wales and Victoria definitely taking the lead, but Queensland, we've got the Olympics up here in Southeast Queensland that is going to, there is some very, very clear objectives with regard to, has to be actually net positive gains, circular gains. And we're also going to see the bars being really lifted in Paris and LA. So that's going to, there's a huge opportunity. Actually, the games could bring a massive legacy to Southeast Queensland and Queensland as a whole. So I think actually potentially the federal government is going to risk becoming a little bit more irrelevant as time goes on if they keep doing what they're doing.
I think too, I know in conversations I've had with John previously, but also with others, John put the number on the table, $130 trillion, I think you said, John, around investment. And, I do think we've seen already just how quickly that's accelerated. I think there's a real sense that that's going to accelerate, to John's point around not just carbon disclosure, but natural capital disclosure. And if anything, if you look at the pace at which the decarbonisation emissions reduction trend in through investors really accelerated, I think that's what we can expect to see more broadly, and that's going to play out as well. Governments have to pay attention to that as well. I think that's just the reality. Joanne, the question I was going to ask you is there is a question around circular economy principles directly, and it's from Dom, I think. Got that right? Dom, thanks for the question. Thanks for telling us who you are. But just how important are the circular economy principles and taking that sort of approach and really progressing that in dealing with emissions reductions? And I would just love you also just take a moment to remind everyone where Australia does sit in the global pecking order of landfill and recycling and circular economy, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah. So Australia doesn't sit great. Certain states are performing an awful lot better than others, but we're the highest generator of waste per capita, second highest generator of waste per capita in the world. And our recycling, resource recovery recycling rate sits just over about 50% in sort of the low 50s. South Australia are, sort of Queen of the Castle. They're in the high 80s, have been for a large time. Queensland is lags at the back and has done for quite a while. And very simply, it's cheap land and an availability of landfill. And we also have tyranny of distance in this country. And you can't ignore the fact that, we are very, very widespread. However, that doesn't negate, the fact that, quite, 90% of the population are focused, sort of in the main populous centres. But really, the fact that it has, access to cheap land and access to landfill and effective landfill. I always say that, one of the things when I came to Australia back 10 years ago, I was here as a backpacker in my early 20s, but there was no waste crisis here. Waste works really well. People put out their bins, and you're the first country, one of the first countries in the world to have yellow top recycling, and very proud you were of it in the early 90s. And there was no ever issue. You never ran out. You were never running out of landfill space. You were never dealing with waste, not being picked up, and and the environmental and human health impacts of it. So when there was no crisis and there was no problem, people were not focused on it. So when I came back over in 2011 and I started focusing in on waste again, people were going, "Why are you focusing on waste? There's no problem with waste. Leave it alone." And then it was the war on waste and the Four Corners, and it exposed the sort of the interstate movement of waste, and particularly the poor practices of Australia's reliance on export. And what we were exporting, and the quality of resource of recycled material we were focusing on back in 2017-18 really sort of changed completely the sort of the Australian population's for appreciation of waste, getting very, very focused on coffee cups, which is good because it's all about it's all about storytelling. So, and that then has really sort of driven then a sort of sort of more interest in the circular economy. I will say, the circular economy sits with this juxtaposition with waste management. It is not advanced waste management. It is far more, and David, it's the circular economy can absolutely deal with your scope 3 emissions. And I liked the idea of you saying with regard to Gladstone shared infrastructure, because that is, avoiding investment is a key circular principle in the first place. So, one of the key challenges we have, and I was actually involved in something last night with the Global Infrastructure Hub, is what is the definition of a circular economy? And one person just very simply said it's systems thinking. It's a systems approach. And if you even think about it that way, we can use the Ellen MacArthur Foundation definition, which is around, so designing out waste and pollution. It's keeping materials in use at their highest order and regenerating natural systems. But then that's quite a level of complexity, and 3 parts of that. So really, if people just think about a circular economy, it's a systems approach to our economy, rather than currently our economy is based on a linear model.
Melinda, I'm sorry. Hey, Joyanne, we should get together with the CSIRO team, because they've got this big mission around waste recycling, and even the enzymes using for breaking down plastic we never thought was going to happen before, organic waste. So they've got a big mission for Australia about being world class. Now, some of the science obviously isn't scalable yet and all those sorts of things, but they're working hard at it. How are the sorts of things we need to be funding to really change the game without sort of pie in the sky, sort of, the technology's down thing. We've got stuff now we can work on and invest in and make a difference. So anyway, if you're interested.
I'd love to, and I know your CSIRO, I know some of your CSIRO colleagues really well, and absolutely, it's not a lack of opportunity and a lack of innovation. It's just a case of where are we actually going to invest, because we've got so many opportunities.
I think I know CSIRO too has been a champion for some of the missions-led sort of approach, which I'm a big fan of as well, which is really just trying to be, put some aspirational targets out there with the belief that we're actually clever enough to get there. So that will be a conversation for another day.
Yeah, we should do that, because I really agree. It drives real innovation, and it's practical, it's real outcomes. So I agree. Anyway, another day.
No, we've got about four more minutes, and there is a question here that I wanted to get to as well, because we've talked a bit about community. In some ways, this is, David, you talked about the important role of business leaning into this as well. Yeah. And we've seen that businesses that do that better in terms of community engagement and the benefits that it delivers. But one of the questions we've got from Dr. Ricky from the ACU is actually sort of challenging us around the role of the consumer, the role of consumption, and how we change behaviours. And I know, over decades, really, there's been a lot of evidence around, consumer surveys and all the rest of it, but revealed behaviour is very different. It comes down to price and all the rest of it. So I'm just really interested in each of you just giving a perspective on how do we deal with consumerism, the consumer, how do we involve them in this response as well? Who first? John, you haven't spoken for a while. I'm going to finger you.
Yeah, John. Good luck, John.
I think consumers are huge stakeholders in this and increasingly aware of the issue. Now, your question is, are they willing to sort of vote with their wallets or not with their wallets, right? Vote by not buying things or making sure they're always getting the most sustainable version of it. So we're in early days, and that has to be a partnership between business and the consumer. So a couple of examples. So, the Patagonia, great company, they're held up as B Corporation and all of this, but they had a great campaign. Don't buy this jacket, right? Against clothing waste. Just don't buy it, right? They sell jackets, by the way. They had a huge thing. Don't buy this. We only want you to buy what you're going to use and wear. I think there you had a company that said, we're willing to stand for this, and we're willing to actually take a financial hit from our short-term sales because this connects us with the consumers we want in the future. So I know at Climate Leaders Coalition, we've had some good discussions with global CEOs. So the global CEO of IKEA, Jesper Brodin, spoke to our members about a year ago. And it's all about their role in getting sustainability into the home. Right? That's where they go. That's what IKEA stuff, it goes into your home. I got tons of it. And it's all about their role in how they can bring that sustainability into your everyday life. And, that stuff's got to last longer. And it's got to teach you about the journey. And I know we had Stephen Kane of Coles, who's a CLC member as well, making a similar leading a discussion. And because it's not all easy, right? He would just equally say these parts are hard, these parts are easy. But we touch so many Australian consumers every week that we have a responsibility, not just to get our own operations green, but also to provide the products at a good price that are going to help those consumers. Is their scope 3 emissions, I suppose, become green too. So there are starting to be examples. I'd say lean into those examples and learn what you can from the IKEAs, the Coles, and the many other companies that are doing this. I think take an experiment in your companies or in your shopping, right? Take an experiment, see how that goes, see what you learn from it.
Yeah, thanks, Joyanne. I might give you the final word on this, and then unfortunately I'm going to have to wrap up.
Yeah, look, I think to me it's quite simple. I mentioned it already. What Arup has done, on Mary Robinson's call out to us is make it personal, and by making it personal, then it becomes relevant to you. I gave a talk to my son's year 4 class a number of years ago around the circular economy, and the kids all looked at me and they just said, "So what? That just seems obvious. Why would you not do that?" So again, they get it, they understand it. At some stage, it gets lost. A key enabler is actually for us to make better choices is actually right to repair, and we lack a lot of right to repair legislation and IP. And IP limitations here in Australia. So we badly need changes to our right to repair legislation and regulation in Australia to enable people to do these things. A lot of time people actually do want to fix things, or they do want to keep it going. They're disabled from doing it. And, a lot of the business to business customers, they don't want you, they actually don't want you. They want to break the connection. So there's a couple of key things. Make it personal, listen to the kids, and think about right to repair legislation.
Melinda, can I grab 30 seconds on this? I really agree with everything's been said. However, my challenge to corporations is green products can be better and cheaper, and go do it. Because I think this assumption that somehow something that is green is more expensive or less impactful is wrong. I mean, I really agree with the repairing. So let's use our innovation to build better green products at a lower price, and then everyone, because I'm a little bit skeptical on human behavior because, I'm not sure that they will always do it, but I make it personal. Sorry.
No, that's fine, David. It would be really rude of me not to allow you to say something, given everything you're bringing to the table. We are out of time, so I am going to quickly wrap up. It's been a really great conversation. To those of you who asked questions, I'm hoping you feel like I kind of got to most of them in one way or another, if I didn't even ask them perfectly as they were. But I think we touched on the really key questions that were coming through around how can we get all business on board? How can we bring the people who are struggling to find a way into this businesses into it? What is the role of the consumer, and where does government sit in this, and how can we do more? I think they're really the three big questions that came out, as well as real thirst for interest around the circular economy. You're not going to be surprised to know that I am going to tell you that we've got more events coming up. Please have a look on the website, CEDA.com.au. In particular, we've got a Women Who Lead Climate Warriors event coming up, which I think is just going to be fantastic. For those of you who are in Western Australia and watching this, we do have our Western Australian State of the State. It is face-to-face. It's going to be massive, so get along to that. And then really all that's left for me to do is to thank David, John and Joyanne for your really great contributions today, and of course to Arup for sponsoring this conversation. It's been a pleasure to be with you again. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you very much.